Every forest hides its secrets, but some truths refuse to stay buried. In a night when flames devoured hope and enemies closed in, the most unlikely savior emerged scarred yet unbroken, carrying with him a memory that time could not erase. This is not just a story of survival, it's proof of a loyalty that outlasts fire, snow, and betrayal. Hit like, subscribe, and comment below what moved you most and where you're watching from, so this story can reach even further. The Montana forest was locked in winter's cruel grip, branches heavy with ice, the night sky bruised with clouds that swallowed the moonlight. In that silence, broken only by the groan of pines, the faint hiss of gasoline became a death sentence. Captain David Brooks, a tall black officer whose steady presence had anchored his department for nearly 2 decades, stirred awake against the biting cold of steel. His wrists burned under coarse rope tied tightly behind his back, his head throbbing with a dull ache from the ambush that had landed them here. Smoke scraped his throat as he coughed, blinking through stinging eyes, until the scene snapped into focus. The bed of a pickup truck tailgate, sealed flames devouring the front seats. His heart clenched. They weren't caught. They were being erased. Beside him, Detective Miguel Alvarez groaned, his sharp jaw clenched as he shifted the ropes digging into his tanned skin. On the other side, rookie Ethan Cole, pale and boyish, whimpered in confusion, his sandy hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, despite the freezing air pouring through cracks in the truck. David turned his head, his dark eyes narrowing, as he realized the full cruelty of the moment. Whoever had set this up knew the storm would bury their remains in ash and snow, hiding every trace. The betrayal felt personal. No common criminal would go to such lengths. Ethan's breathing turned into panicked gasps. "We're going to burn alive." His voice cracked, full of terror that ripped through the air like shattering glass. Miguel cursed, jerking his hands until his wrists bled the ropes holding fast. Think David rasped, his voice raw but commanding. "Panic won't save us. Use it. Channel it." Smoke poured heavier now, thick ribbons curling into their lungs, every inhale scorching. The flames crept higher, licking at the roof. The air shimmered with heat that seemed to mock the snow outside. David's memories flashed unbidden, the face of his late wife, lost in a hiking accident years ago, her laughter forever unfinished. He had stayed on the force for her, for the belief that protecting others gave meaning to his pain. Yet here he was, caged in a fiery tomb, helpless. The truck groaned under the pressure, a window exploding outward with a deafening crack. Shards scattered across them, one cutting a shallow line across David's cheek. Miguel snarled, using his shoulder to bash against the wall, but the sound was hollow, mocking, as though the truck itself refused to yield. David's wrists burned with every futile twist. Smoke coiled thicker. Ethan coughed violently, collapsing to his side, his chest rising in desperate heaves. "I can't breathe," he whispered, his voice breaking like dry wood. David leaned toward him, pressing his shoulder into the younger man's. "Stay with us. You hear me? You're not leaving us now." But even his steady tone cracked at the edges. The fire snapped hungrily, its rhythm a countdown to doom. Sparks rained onto the truck bed like falling stars, igniting patches of cloth and gear. David's vision blurred as oxygen thinned, but his instincts sharpened. This wasn't an accident. The ambush in the forest, the blow to the head, the ropes, the gasoline, it was all planned, and only someone with inside knowledge could have orchestrated it. His heart pounded with fury. They weren't just supposed to die, they were supposed to vanish without question. Miguel gritted his teeth, veins bulging at his temples, as he jerked harder against the restraint, skin tearing at his wrists. Damn it, they set us up. Someone from Helena PD has to be. David wanted to deny it, but the evidence was cruelly clear. Betrayal ran deep. The fire crept closer, heat blistering his skin. His chest screamed for air. For a moment, despair clawed its way into his resolve, whispering that maybe this was the end, that maybe the darkness would finally take him. But then a sound cut through the roar of fire and the hiss of melting snow, a steady crunch of paws pressing into ice. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the inferno, but it grew sharper, closer. David froze, his instincts battling confusion. Through the swirling smoke outside the tailgate, a shadow moved low and quick, almost spectral. Then it emerged into the firelight, a large German shepherd, scarred frost clinging to its singed fur, one ear bent, a long, healed gash visible along its flank. Its coat, once sable, was now dulled by ash and mud. Its eyes locked onto the flames, then onto David's. For a heartbeat, time fractured. David's throat tightened. He knew this dog. Years ago, during a joint training exercise, this same shepherd had brushed against his leg, eager, sharp-eyed. They had called him Shadow a K9, who had vanished during a raid gone wrong, presumed buried forever. Yet here he stood, battered but alive, like a ghost refusing to fade. Shadow leapt onto the truck bed, with practiced grace, ignoring the smoke that would have sent lesser creatures fleeing. He pressed his muzzle against David's shoulder, sniffed the ropes, then clamped down, teeth sawing carefully. The coarse fibers resisted before snapping under his powerful jaws. Shadow's fur was patchy, one paw bleeding from glass shards, yet his eyes carried a sharpness that made David's chest tighten with recognition. This was no ordinary stray. This was a survivor, one who had returned at the moment when all hope was lost. Ethan Cole clung to David's arm, still trembling from the near suffocation, his face pale as paper. That dog. It knew exactly what to do, he whispered, his voice shaking with awe. Detective Miguel Alvarez wiped blood from his wrists, his sharp gaze fixed on Shadow. No way this is a coincidence. He's trained, disciplined. Dogs don't just walk into fire unless they've been conditioned to do it. David crouched low, extending a cautious hand toward the shepherd, but Shadow didn't flinch. Instead, the dog sniffed once, then pressed his muzzle into David's palm, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. A memory crashed into David's mind like thunder 5 years ago in Missoula, a collapsed building, a desperate dig through rubble, and a K9 handler screaming for help as beams pinned his partner. David had crawled through, risking his own life, pulling a half-dead German shepherd into the light. That same shepherd had licked his hand once before going limp, and David had never seen him again. They had said he died during transport, yet here he was, alive. Shadow David whispered, his throat tightening. The dog's ears perked as if the name struck a bell deep inside his memory. Miguel glanced sharply between them. "You know this dog?" David didn't answer. There was no time. The truck's twisted metal shrieked as fire devoured what remained. "We need to move," David ordered, his voice firm but low. "If someone set this up, they'll make sure we don't walk away." And Shadow, his gaze dropped to the dog. "He's not just wandering, he's leading us." Shadow padded forward, limping slightly, but with a deliberate pace, pausing to look back until they followed. The snow crunched under their boots, the flames behind them glowing like a beacon of their narrow escape. Miguel moved close to David. This was no random ambush. They knew exactly where to find us, tied us up, lit the fire, and walked away expecting the storm to finish the job. That means we're dealing with professionals, and worse, they're probably still watching. David's jaw tightened. He had thought betrayal before, but now the weight of it pressed on him like an iron shackle. Someone with access to Helena PD intelligence had orchestrated this. Ethan stumbled, his legs unsteady, still coughing smoke from his lungs. David grabbed him under the arm. "Stay up, kid. Panic is over. Now it's survival." Shadow suddenly stopped at the edge of a frozen slope, his body rigid, ears pivoting like radar. He growled low, nose pressed to the ground, before moving toward a cluster of trees. Miguel frowned. "He's tracking something." The 3 officers followed, stepping carefully through snowdrifts. Halfway down, Ethan tripped over something half buried. He bent down and lifted it, a scorched piece of fabric. The initials stitched into the corner froze the air in their lungs. HPD, Helena Police Department gear. Miguel cursed under his breath. "Son of a bitch, that's ours." David took the fabric, his expression darkening. This was planted, or dropped by someone who knew exactly what we'd find. Ethan's voice trembled. "You mean, one of us?" David didn't answer, but his silence spoke louder than any words. Shadow barked once, sharp and commanding, snapping their attention back. He moved ahead, circling around something. As the men drew closer, they saw it, a crude snare trap buried under snow wire, glinting faintly in the dim light. Miguel crouched low, inspecting it with a scowl. "That's no deer trap. That's human height. Whoever laid this wanted to catch us or anyone else unlucky enough to wander near." David's stomach clenched. This wasn't just about silencing 3 officers. This was a kill zone. The forest wasn't just wilderness anymore. It was rigged, wired, prepared. Shadow continued leading them, his steps steady despite his injuries. They moved through dense thickets, snow falling harder now, muffling every sound except the crunch of boots and the dog's steady breathing. Behind them, the glow of the burning truck faded, swallowed by trees, but its memory lingered, searing into their minds as proof of how close death had come. After nearly an hour of trudging through the unforgiving woods, Shadow finally stopped near a break in the trees. Ahead, nestled against a ridge, stood a small, leaning cabin. Its wood was weathered roof sagging, a shutter banging faintly in the wind. Smoke stains marked the chimney, though no fire burned now. Shadow ran ahead and scratched at the door, then looked back at them. Miguel muttered, "You have got to be kidding me. He just led us to shelter." David exhaled, his muscles aching, his legs stiff with every step. "Not luck," he said softly. "Instinct. Or memory." Miguel pushed the door open with his shoulder, the hinges creaking under the weight of years. Inside was stale air. A single room with warped floorboards, shelves lined with expired cans, and a stone hearth blackened with soot. A small cot slumped in the corner, a mildewed blanket tossed across it. Ethan nearly collapsed onto the cot, his face ashen, his body racked with shivers. I don't feel right," he muttered, sweat streaming down his forehead despite the bitter cold. Miguel touched his skin, his brow furrowing. Fever, smoke inhalation. If we don't treat him, he won't last. David scanned the room with weary eyes, despair threatening to take root again. But Shadow was already moving, circling every corner, sniffing every surface, as if mapping the space. Finally, he padded to the hearth and sat, his gaze fixed on David with a patience that felt almost human. David sank to the floor, his chest heavy, his mind replaying the chaos. Shadow had not truly rested since they entered. Even with his injured paw, he remained alert, guarding the three men, as if the task was ingrained in his very bones. David rubbed a hand across his tired face, the truth pressing against him with unbearable weight. Whoever had orchestrated the ambush wanted them not just dead, but erased, swallowed by fire and snow without a trace. The scorched scarf Ethan had stumbled upon in the forest, marked with the insignia of Helena Police Department, still lay on the shelf where David had placed it, and its presence gnawed at him like an open wound. Ethan stirred again, his voice weak. "Captain, I saw the initials. HPD. How could it?" His sentence broke into a cough, his body shivering violently despite the blanket Miguel had wrapped around him. Miguel clenched his jaw. "Because someone on the inside is dirty. Someone with access to our routes, our leads, our damn schedules. This wasn't random. It was surgical." David didn't answer immediately. He stared into the flames, watching them devour the wood, listening to the steady drip of melting snow through the cabin roof. "Betrayal from the outside, you can fight," he said. Finally, his voice low and heavy. "Betrayal from within that cuts deeper than any wound." Shadow lifted his head as if sensing the despair in David's words. He stood limping toward the shelf, his nose brushing against the burnt scarf. He sniffed it once, then gave a short, sharp bark. David's chest tightened. It was as if the dog himself confirmed what they all feared, that the enemy wore a badge. Miguel's eyes darkened. If someone from Helena PD is working with them, we're in more danger than we realize. They'll know the terrain. They'll know how we think they'll know what we'll do next. David nodded, grimly pushing himself to his feet despite the pain in his leg. Then, we stopped being predictable. Ethan tried to sit up, his breathing shallow, but Miguel pressed him back down. "You need rest, kid. You won't make it 2 miles in this condition." Ethan's eyes watered with frustration. "I don't want to be dead weight." David crouched beside him, gripping his shoulder firmly. "You're not dead weight. You're alive, and that means you fight however you can. Rest now. We'll carry you if we must." Outside, a branch snapped in the distance, loud enough to slice through the wind. Shadow's body stiffened, ears pointing like arrows. He growled low, his hackles rising. Miguel moved instantly to the window, peering through the broken shutter. "Tracks," he muttered. "Fresh ones." David's pulse quickened. He grabbed the fire poker, the only weapon they had. "How many?" Miguel squinted. 2 sets. Heavy boots. Military-grade tread. They circled the cabin once. Ethan whispered fear, cracking his voice. "Are they coming in?" Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, then bolted to the door, pressing his body against it as though barring entry. David clenched his jaw. "No, not yet. They're watching. They want us to panic, to move before we're ready." Miguel swore under his breath. "This is cat and mouse, Captain, and right now, we're the mice." The night stretched on every creak of the cabin, a reminder of eyes in the dark. Ethan drifted in and out of fever dreams. Miguel paced like a caged predator, and David sat by Shadow, one hand resting on the dog's scarred fur, as though drawing strength from the silent sentinel. Hours later, as the fire burned low, Shadow stirred suddenly. He padded to the far corner of the cabin, nose pressed against the floorboards. With surprising strength, he pawed at the wood until a loose plank shifted, revealing a small hidden space. David's eyes widened. Inside the gap was a rusted box containing old photographs, a cracked compass, and a folded map stained with age. Miguel pulled the map free, studying it in the dim firelight. These are patrol routes, old ones from the 80s. Whoever lived here knew the land inside out. David turned the compass over in his palm, its needle trembling but still true. He placed it in his pocket, a small piece of certainty in a night filled with shadows. Among the photographs, one caught his breath. A young officer stood with a German shepherd, proud and strong, before a cabin that looked eerily similar to the one they now hid in. Scribbled on the back were the initials LM 1987. David whispered, "Shadow. He's been here before." The dog wagged his tail once, faint but undeniable. The realization sank like a stone in David's chest. This wasn't just chance. The dog wasn't just saving them. He was returning to a place tied to his past, as though guided by memory. Miguel's gaze hardened. Whoever ran this ambush underestimated him. They thought he was gone, but he's back, and he remembers. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint mechanical hum. David's stomach dropped. He motioned for silence. Miguel killed the fire, plunging them into near darkness. Through the broken shutter, David caught a small black drone, hovering, its lens glinting red before vanishing into the snowstorm. Ethan groaned weakly. "They know we're alive." David tightened his grip on the fire poker. "Then we make sure they regret it." He looked down at Shadow, whose eyes glowed in the dim light, fierce and unyielding. For the first time since the fire, David felt not just fear, but resolve. Captain David Brooks sat on the edge of the cot where the young officer lay, pressing a damp rag against Ethan's forehead, while Miguel Alvarez searched the shelves with a flashlight that flickered on low battery, finding nothing but expired cans, moldy jerky, and relics of a life long abandoned. Shadow, the scarred shepherd who had already defied death once tonight, paced restlessly, his paws crunching softly against warped floorboards, his ears tilting to every sound in the storm outside. The evidence of betrayal gnawed at David's chest like teeth. The burned scarf marked HPD, and the drone's mechanical eye proved that whoever was behind this wasn't just hunting them with violence, but with precision strategy and resources that few outside the force could possess. Betrayal from inside the badge was the most poisonous kind. And, as David looked at Ethan's pale face and Miguel's furrowed brow, he felt the burden of leadership pressing heavier than the storm. Ethan stirred, his lips cracked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Captain, I'm sorry. I slowed you down." David squeezed his shoulder, his dark eyes fierce. "You're alive. That's what matters. We don't leave our own behind." Miguel returned from the shelves, empty-handed, shaking his head. "There's nothing useful here. No medkits, no clean food, nothing but ghosts." David glanced toward Shadow, who had stopped pacing and now stood stiff near the door, nose pressed against the cracked body, coiled with intent. Suddenly, the dog pushed through, disappearing into the white fury outside. Shadow, David called, but the wind swallowed his voice. Miguel grabbed his arm. "Let him go. He knows what he's doing." Every instinct in David screamed against it, but he nodded, because Shadow was more than an animal. Now he was the only reason they were still breathing. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The storm roared, shaking the cabin, and Ethan shivered violently despite the blanket Miguel had wrapped around him. Then, just when despair began to creep back, the door banged open. Shadow limped in his fur coated with snow, and dangling from his jaws was a scorched black duffel bag. He dropped it heavily on the floor before collapsing to his side chest, heaving blood seeping from his injured paw. Miguel was at the bag in seconds, unzipping it with shaking hands, and what he found made his breath catch. Inside was a standard-issue emergency medkit, its edges scorched, but its contents intact. Gauze burn cream, antibiotics, heat packs, even a small flashlight with spare batteries. "You've got to be kidding me," Miguel muttered, awe softening his normally sharp tone. He went back. He went back to the truck. David knelt beside Shadow, stroking his scarred fur with trembling hands. "You risked everything for us." The dog lifted his head weakly, his eyes meeting David's, and for a moment the world shrank to just them, the officer who had once saved him, and the dog who now returned that debt with unwavering loyalty. Miguel wasted no time breaking open the kit. He applied cream to Ethan's burns, wrapped gauze around his wrists, and administered antibiotics with the precision of his Marine training. David tore strips from his own undershirt to bind his thigh wound tighter, gritting his teeth against the sting, while Miguel snapped a heat pack and slipped it under Ethan's blanket. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the color began to return to the rookie's face, his breathing easing from shallow gasps to steadier rhythm. David sat back exhausted, but relief coursed through him like fire chasing away frost. "He'll make it," Miguel muttered, though his tone carried caution. "But he's not out of danger. We need real medical care soon." David nodded grimly, "And we'll get it, one way or another." As the fire popped in the hearth, shadows flickered across the warped walls. David's gaze fell again on the hidden box Shadow had uncovered earlier, the initials LM 1987, carved into the back of a faded photograph. He studied the image, the young officer with a shepherd at his side, standing proudly before a cabin that looked hauntingly similar to this one. Could it be that Shadow had once belonged here? That this cabin was not just shelter, but memory? He felt the weight of history pressing in the sense that they were walking a path carved long before this night. Miguel sat beside him, his jaw tight. "This dog isn't just surviving, he's leading us. You see that, right?" David's eyes softened, his voice low. "He's not just a dog, he's a partner. Maybe the only one we can trust now." Outside, the storm deepened, a curtain of white sealing them in. But inside the cabin, the air shifted. For the first time since the ambush, hope began to push back against despair, fragile but real. Shadow, scarred and battered, had brought them what they needed most. Not just medicine, not just warmth, but proof that they were not abandoned. Proof that loyalty still lived, even when the world tried to bury it in fire and betrayal. Ethan stirred again, his fever breaking slightly, and his eyes opened just enough to find Shadow lying near him. "He saved me," the rookie whispered weakly. David nodded, his voice catching. "Yes, he saved all of us." The night stretched on, but within the cabin, surrounded by relics of forgotten lives, and the steady breathing of a dog who had returned from the ashes, they found strength to face what was coming. For they all knew the storm outside was not their only enemy. Shadow lay by the door, his scarred body curled tight, but his ears rotating constantly, every gust of wind, every branch snapping, under the weight of snow pulling a low growl from his throat. David knew sleep was impossible. Betrayal had burned away the comfort of rest, leaving only vigilance and questions that clawed deeper with every hour. Who within Helena PD had set them up? How deep did the rot go? The burned scarf with its insignia was no longer just evidence, it was a knife twisting in the back of every oath he had ever sworn. The drone earlier had confirmed that they were not just abandoned to die, but actively monitored, hunted like prey, and the thought poisoned the air in the cabin more than the smoke had. A sudden crunch outside froze all of them where they sat. Shadow bolted upright, his hackles raised, his teeth bared in silent warning. David grabbed the fire poker again, every muscle tightening, while Miguel killed the flickering flashlight, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the faint red glow of embers. They held their breath, listening. Another sound followed, faint but deliberate, a scraping against wood just outside the window. Miguel moved silently to the shutter, peeking through a sliver. What he saw made his jaw clench, two sets of footprints fresh in the snow circling the cabin, their size and depth, proving they were made minutes ago. Heavy tactical boots, one pair larger and heavier, the other lighter, perhaps a lookout. He whispered the details to David, whose expression hardened into stone. "They're watching us. Close. They want us to move first," he said, his voice low and tight. Ethan stirred weakly, sensing the tension, whispering in a cracked voice. "Are they coming in?" David pressed a hand against his shoulder. "Stay quiet. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be gone." This is psychological warfare. Shadow let out one sharp bark, so sudden and commanding that it made even Miguel flinch. The dog moved to the door, sniffed at the bottom seam, then snarled a deep guttural sound that reverberated through the small space like a warning bell. Without hesitation, Shadow lunged against the door, shoving it open with his body, and darted into the snowstorm. Shadow, David hissed, but the shepherd had already vanished into the blinding white. For tense minutes, the only sound was the wind whipping through the trees. But then a cry cut through the storm, not from the dog, but from a man sharp and startled, quickly muffled. Miguel grinned without humor. He found one. David tightened his grip on the poker, torn between the instinct to chase after the dog and the responsibility to protect the men inside. Minutes later, Shadow reappeared at the door, his muzzle wet with blood, his breath heavy, his fur bristling. He padded inside calmly, his eyes glowing fierce in the dim light, then lay down by the fire as if to say the threat was contained for now. Miguel shut the door firmly, his eyes narrowing. That wasn't just a stray scout, that was a test. They're probing us, trying to see if we're weak enough to strike. And they just learned we're not alone. David nodded, kneeling by Shadow, brushing snow from his fur, whispering softly, "Good boy. You're the reason we're still standing." But even as relief touched him, another worry pressed in. If their enemy knew they were alive, why had they not attacked in force? What were they waiting for? The answer came when Miguel rummaged through the shelves once more, scanning for anything useful, and his flashlight beam caught a glint behind the hearth. He pried at the warped boards until he pulled free a small black object half buried in dust. His eyes widened. It was another drone. Its blade snapped. Lens shattered its casing, marked with a custom serial number. David turned it over in his hands, his expression grim. This isn't hobby gear. This is military-grade surveillance. Whoever's after us isn't just a rogue cop. They've got funding, training, and resources. Miguel spat to the side. Mercenaries, hired guns, which means whoever betrayed us had money and motive. David's stomach twisted, and reach. Because this isn't the kind of operation you hide in a small town without help from higher up. Ethan coughed weakly, his voice faint but cutting. So, they're not just trying to kill us, they're making sure no one ever knows why. Silence fell heavy after his words, broken only by the wind rattling the loose shutter. David forced himself to stand, ignoring the ache in his leg. He looked around the cabin at Miguel's bruised face, Ethan's pale one, and the battered dog still standing guard, and he knew the truth. David Brooks had not slept, his mind replaying the fresh tracks outside the drone in his hands, and the guttural bark Shadow had unleashed before charging into the storm. They were being stalked, tested, but not yet struck down, which meant something larger was at play. Miguel Alvarez crouched by the window, eyes scanning the pale gray horizon, his breath fogging against the cracked shutter. Ethan Cole stirred weakly, his fever breaking in uneven waves, his skin damp, but his breathing steadier than the night before. Shadow paced again, his tail, rigid ears pinned back his body, a taut wire of warning. David crouched beside the dog, running a hand through his scarred fur, feeling both gratitude and dread. "What do you hear?" he whispered, though he knew the dog could not answer in words. Yet Shadow turned his head sharply, staring into the tree line, and the answer came moments later. Figures moved out of the snow, 6 of them dressed in black tactical gear, their rifles slung with the confidence of men who had used them many times before. They moved like shadows with intent, scanning the trees, stepping with the precision of predators who knew the land. Miguel's eyes narrowed. They're not cops. Not military either. Professionals, but not official. These are mercs. David's jaw clenched as he remembered the insignia, scarf, the drone, the ambush. Someone bought them, and someone inside gave them everything they needed. One of the men raised a satellite phone to his mouth, his voice carrying faintly through the wind. "If Craven finds tracks, he'll skin us alive." The name landed heavy in the snow. Craven. David's chest tightened at the recognition. Marcus Craven, the disgraced former police commissioner, once revered and then accused of corruption so vast it threatened to dismantle the entire department. The charges had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and Craven himself had vanished into obscurity. And now, here he was not gone, but thriving, commanding killers in the frozen wilderness. Miguel hissed under his breath. So it's him. It was always him. David's fists clenched so tight his knuckles ached. He betrayed the badge long before tonight. Now he's tying up loose ends. Ethan stirred on the cot, his voice weak but determined. "We can't stay here. If they circle us, we're done." David nodded grimly. "Then we don't let them circle us. We follow the one who knows the land better than anyone." His eyes shifted to Shadow, who was already pressed against the door waiting. Without waiting for argument, the shepherd bolted into the underbrush, his body moving like a streak of smoke against the white storm. David heaved Ethan up, draping the rookie's arm across his shoulder, while Miguel grabbed what little supplies they had. Together they pushed into the storm, following Shadow's tracks, as gunfire cracked behind them. The cabin walls splintered under the first barrage, wood exploding into shards, the sound of automatic fire rattling the small valley. David didn't look back. The cabin that had sheltered them for a night was now being shredded, consumed by bullets and flame. Shadow led them down a deer trail hidden beneath snowdrifts, his paws sinking, but his pace unbroken. David gritted his teeth against the agony in his thigh as blood seeped into the bandage, but he forced his legs to move, dragging Ethan along, while Miguel covered their rear with nothing but a sharpened stick and sheer defiance. They stumbled across a frozen gulch, the snow brittle over jagged rocks, and Shadow barked once sharply, then darted left, guiding them through a narrow pass flanked by fallen logs. Behind them, voices shouted commands, mercenaries spreading wide to trap them, their boots crunching closer with every second. "We won't outrun them," Miguel growled. David's eyes burned with determination. "We don't need to. We need to outthink them." And he nodded toward Shadow, "he already is." The dog darted ahead, then doubled back, barking in a rhythm that almost seemed like code. He circled near a ridge, drawing attention with loud snarls, before vanishing into thickets. The mercenaries cursed their formation, splitting half pursuing the phantom barks, while the others slowed, unsure of where to focus. Shadow had bought them moments, but at a cost. When he reappeared, his paw was bleeding again, his chest heaving, but his eyes still burned with urgency. David crouched, whispering, "You're leading us somewhere." Shadow turned sharply and bolted again. They followed until the trees opened to reveal a ravine where an old steel trap lay rusting, half buried under ice. Shadow barked furiously, circling it, and then the realization hit. The ravine was littered with them, old hunting traps, snares, pits camouflaged with snow. Shadow was leading them into a minefield of forgotten dangers, but also one that could be turned against their pursuers. Miguel grinned grimly. "He's not just keeping us alive, he's setting them up." David maneuvered Ethan carefully through the treacherous ground, each step a gamble against hidden steel. The mercenaries, less cautious, crashed forward in pursuit. Moments later, a scream ripped through the storm as one of them triggered a trap, the snap of steel echoing like thunder. The others shouted in alarm, firing blindly into the trees, their discipline fractured. Shadow growled his ears, pricked his body, vibrating with urgency. David realized the truth: this wasn't luck. The dog remembered. He had lived in these woods, survived them, mapped them with his senses. Now he was weaponizing that knowledge for them. The storm masked their escape as they pushed deeper, but even as adrenaline surged, David's heart pounded with rage. Craven had sent them here to die in silence, but they had survived. The fire survived the cabin, and now the forest itself was rising with them. He looked down at Shadow, battered, scarred but unbroken, and he swore silently that they would not only survive, but expose the man who had orchestrated it all. Miguel caught his eye, his expression fierce despite exhaustion. "We keep moving, Captain. But when this is over, Craven pays." David nodded, his jaw tight. No doubt about it. Behind them, the mercenaries regrouped, shouts blending with the storm, but their pursuit was slower now. Cautious of traps, David tightened his grip on Ethan, whose eyes fluttered with fever, but whose lips formed the words, "Don't leave me." David pulled him closer, his voice steady despite the storm. Behind them, the mercenaries' shouts had grown fainter, muffled by the terrain, and the traps that had already claimed at least one of their number. But David knew they weren't gone, only slowed. The men chasing them were hardened killers, and Marcus Craven had never been one to leave unfinished business. When at last, Shadow guided them to the mouth of a rocky hollow beneath a ledge, David nearly collapsed from the relief of shelter. Miguel helped drag Ethan inside, laying the rookie against the cold wall, while David slumped beside him, his thigh wound bleeding sluggishly into the snow-packed dirt floor. Shadow entered last, his chest heaving, his eyes still locked on the forest outside, as if daring it to reveal its threats. For a long while they sat in silence, the storm's howl muffled by stone, the only sound Ethan's ragged breathing and the faint scrape of Shadow's claws as he curled protectively in front of the hollow's entrance. David leaned back against the rock, exhaustion pulling at his eyelids, but his gaze lingered on the dog. There was something more than instinct in the way Shadow moved, in the way he anticipated every trap, every ambush. This was not just survival, this was memory guiding him. David reached out slowly, brushing his hand across the shepherd's fur, feeling the raised scars beneath. His throat tightened with recognition. He remembered a night 5 years ago in the Bitterroot Mountains when a landslide had buried a ranger station. He had led the rescue team himself, digging through rubble with frozen hands until he found a trapped K9 pinned under beams, its muzzle bleeding its leg, broken, its eyes fading. That dog had licked his hand weakly before going limp, and David had passed him to medics, never to see him again. They had told him the dog had not survived transport, but here he was, alive, battered, yet standing. David whispered, his voice raw. "You remembered me, didn't you?" Shadow lifted his head, those deep brown eyes locking onto David's, and then the shepherd leaned forward, pressing his head into David's chest in the exact same gesture from that night. The memory hit David like a knife to the heart, and for the first time since the ambush, tears burned at the edges of his vision. Miguel watched quietly, his sharp eyes softening. "So it's true. You knew him before?" David nodded, his voice breaking. "I saved him once. Now he's saving us." Ethan stirred, half-conscious, his lips moving. "He's one of us," he whispered before slipping back into fevered sleep. David stroked the dog's fur, his jaw tightening with renewed resolve. "He is. And with him, we're getting out of this." The storm outside deepened into night, the temperature dropping until their breath came in visible clouds even inside the hollow. Miguel rotated between watching the entrance and checking Ethan's pulse, his marine calm never faltering, though David could see the exhaustion in his hunched shoulders. At one point, Miguel crouched beside David, speaking low. "They'll regroup. They'll come again. We can't stay here long." David nodded. "I know. But right now, Ethan won't survive another mile. We need to give him hours at least." Miguel glanced toward Shadow, who had risen again and was pacing the mouth of the hollow like a sentinel. "Then he'll be the one to buy us that time." The words hung heavy because they all knew what they meant. Shadow would face danger head-on, if it came, even if it broke him. Hours crawled by. David fought against sleep, but eventually drifted into a shallow haze, his mind replaying the fire, the ambush, the betrayal, until Shadow's low growl snapped him awake. He looked up to see the shepherd stiff at the entrance, ears pinned, eyes locked on the snow. David tightened his grip on the fire poker they had carried from the cabin, signaling Miguel awake. Together they listened, and then they heard it too, the faint crunch of boots in the snow, methodical and steady. The mercenaries had found their trail again. David's pulse thundered in his ears. Miguel whispered, "If they find this hollow, we're trapped." David looked at Shadow, who growled again, then looked back at him with eyes that seemed to hold intent. Before David could stop him, the dog slipped silently into the storm, disappearing into the dark. Shadow David hissed, but Miguel grabbed his arm. "Let him, he knows what he's doing." David's stomach churned as the sounds outside shifted. Shouts rang faintly, followed by barks so fierce and rapid they echoed like a dozen animals at once. Gunshots cracked, muffled by snow curses slicing through the night. David held his breath, every instinct screaming to go after him, but Ethan moaned weakly, dragging him back to his duty. Minutes stretched into eternity, until at last a shape appeared at the mouth of the hollow. Shadow stumbled inside his paw, torn and bleeding anew, his muzzle streaked with blood, but his eyes alive with defiance. He collapsed beside David, chest heaving, but even as he bled, his ears remained pricked, his gaze still sharp. David pulled him close, pressing his hand against the wound. "You're not dying on me. Not again." Shadow licked his wrist once weak, but deliberate, and David's throat closed with emotion. Miguel crouched beside them, checking Ethan again, then looking toward David. Miguel Alvarez crouched over Ethan Cole, whose fever had eased slightly, but whose body remained fragile. The rookie's breath shallow yet steady, as the antibiotics finally began to do their work. For a moment, David allowed himself to believe they might make it, but he knew the truth: the mercenaries were regrouping, and Marcus Craven would not rest until every loose end was silenced. They needed more than survival now. They needed a lifeline. Shadow stirred suddenly, pushing himself upright despite the pain in his paw. He limped toward the mouth of the hollow, his nose-lifted ears twitching. David followed him out into the biting cold, squinting across the valley, where the storm had thinned enough to reveal a jagged ridge. Beyond it, barely visible, a fire lookout tower stood like a sentinel above the frozen treetops, its roof sagging but its frame intact. Hope flickered in David's chest. "A radio," he muttered. "There has to be one." Miguel followed his gaze, his expression hardening into determination. "If we can reach it, maybe we can call for help. But it's exposed. They'll see us moving toward it." David glanced at Shadow, who stood stiff-tail low, his body vibrating with intent. "He'll guide us. He hasn't failed us yet." They roused Ethan carefully, draping his arms across their shoulders, the rookie gritting his teeth through fevered pain, but nodding his willingness to push forward. Every step toward that ridge was agony. David's thigh wound screaming with each shift, but he forced his legs to move every ounce of his strength, anchored by the presence of the dog weaving steadily ahead, pausing to ensure they followed. The climb toward the tower was brutal. Snow reached their knees, the wind sliced across their faces, and their lungs burned with cold. But the wooden structure drew closer, a beacon against the endless white. Shadow barked once when they reached the porch, then pushed inside through the frame of a missing door. The air within was stale dust, thick mouse droppings scattered across the floor, but against the far wall sat a battered radio desk coated in grime. Miguel lowered Ethan onto a cot, then moved quickly to the desk, flipping switches, tapping the side of the emergency battery. A red light blinked faintly. David exhaled, his chest tightening with fragile hope. "Channel 16, he instructed. "Emergency frequency." Miguel tuned the dial static, screaming through the silence until a faint voice cracked through coast visibility. "Poor Montana North sectors. Repeat." Miguel seized the microphone. "This is Detective Miguel Alvarez, Helena Police Department. We are in need of immediate rescue. 3 officers injured, 1 canine wounded. Our location: Fire Lookout Tower, East Ridge, Clearwater Forest." "Do you copy?" Static stretched, crushing their hope. Then a garbled response came. "Confirm. Repeat coordinates. Signal weak." Miguel repeated the message, his voice sharper, his hand trembling slightly as he pressed the transmitter again. This time the response came clearer. "Copy. Air unit dispatched. ETA 90 minutes. Hold position. Stay online if able." Relief washed through the room, but Shadow growled low, his body stiff. His ears pivoted sharply toward the shattered window. David's instincts fired an instant before the glass exploded inward. Gunshots ripped through the room shards, spraying like knives. David dove to the side, crashing against a rusted cabinet, while Miguel dragged Ethan behind the cot, shielding him with his body. Shadow lunged, his bark booming like thunder as 3 figures stormed through the doorway. Marcus Craven entered first, tall and broad, wrapped in a dark overcoat, despite the gear beneath his gray eyes dead of expression, his silver beard giving him the air of a patriarch twisted by cruelty. To his left strode Logan Burr, bald and scarred, his hawkish nose twisted with malice. To his right, Drew Malik, younger, pale-skinned with fiery red hair, his tactical gear too clean for the grime on his face, but his knife already gleaming in his hand. Craven leveled his pistol at David, his voice cold as the snow outside. "You should have stayed in the fire, Brooks. Now you'll die slow." The trigger pulled back, but Shadow moved first. The Shepherd launched like a bullet, jaws clamping around Craven's wrist, driving the shot wild into the wooden beam above David's head. Craven roared, staggering back, as blood poured down his sleeve. Miguel surged forward, tackling Burr into a locker, fists swinging with brutal precision. Drew lunged toward David, knife flashing, but David drove his knee into the man's shin, snatching Craven's dropped pistol from the floor. He rose with a snarl, training the barrel on Craven, who was still locked in struggle with Shadow. "Let him go," David barked, his voice a roar, "or I'll put you down right here." Craven froze, his face contorted with pain, his eyes narrowing with venom. Shadow growled, finally releasing his grip, his muzzle slick with blood, but his body still braced for another strike. Miguel pinned Burr with a knee to his chest, yanking zip ties from the man's vest to bind his hands. David aimed the pistol at Malik, forcing him to drop the knife before cuffing him the same way. When at last the 3 mercenaries knelt bound on the cabin floor, breathing hard but subdued, David turned his gaze to the folder Craven had dropped in the scuffle. Miguel scooped it up, flipping it open. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents, ledgers, coded logs, names, coordinates, sums of money. His jaw tightened. This isn't just corruption, this is trafficking. Craven's been moving people like cargo laundering through shell companies. This is bigger than we imagined. David's stomach churned with fury. Craven chuckled through bloodied teeth, his smile a blade. "You think you've won, Brooks? You think the feds will save you? I own half the men who wear your badge. You'll die in these woods, and the world will never know." David pressed the pistol harder against his skull, his voice low but burning with fire. "No. You'll live to face justice, and everyone will know." He keyed the mic with his free hand, his voice steady. "This is Captain David Brooks. We have 3 hostiles restrained. Data recovered on site. Helicopter requested urgently." Behind him, Shadow limped back to his side, blood streaking his fur, but his eyes steady, never leaving the door, as if still expecting more danger. Miguel tightened the restraints on Burr and Malik, then looked toward David. "We hold them until the chopper comes. 90 minutes, that's all we need." The lookout tower creaked beneath the weight of the storm, as the minutes dragged into hours, every second sharpened by the knowledge that Rescue was inbound, but danger was far from over. Captain David Brooks sat with his back pressed against the battered desk, pistol firm, in his grip eyes never leaving the bound figures of Marcus Craven, Logan Burr, and Drew Malik. Miguel Alvarez paced slowly, knife in hand, his marine instincts alive and restless, while Ethan Cole, pale but steadier now, leaned against the cot wrapped in blankets, his fever cooled enough that his voice had returned through weak. Shadow lay at David's side, his scarred body curled, but alert, his ears pricked at every sound outside. The air was thick with smoke and blood, the aftermath of the firefight lingering like a phantom. Craven broke the silence first, his voice calm despite the blood dripping from his torn sleeve. "You think a helicopter changes anything? The forest belongs to me. The men I've hired, the silence I've bought, it doesn't end with me in cuffs." David's jaw tightened as he glanced at the folder Miguel had secured, the ledgers filled with names and numbers that would expose everything. "It ends here," David growled, "and the whole world is going to know what you've done." Craven chuckled low and dark. "You'll never make it out alive." His words were punctuated by a sudden thud against the tower wall, snow shaken from its beams. Miguel spun, weapon raised, his voice tense. "They're not done. He had more men." David cursed under his breath. "They'll want him back before we can hand him over." Outside, shapes moved through the trees, dark against the white Moor mercenaries drawn by the failed mission of their comrades. Shadow growled deep, his body stiff as a board, his fur bristling. The lookout, once a beacon of hope, was now a fragile cage. Miguel moved quickly, barricading the broken door with splintered planks and the rusted stove, while David helped Ethan to a corner away from the windows. The first shots rang out, glass shattering as bullets tore into the tower wood, splintering into clouds of dust. David ducked low, returning fire through the gaps, his shots cracking across the valley. Miguel joined him, moving with lethal precision, every motion honed by years in war zones. Shadow lunged toward the shattered frame, barking furiously, his presence like thunder cutting through the hail of bullets. One mercenary tried to breach, climbing the porch, but Shadow launched through the opening, clamping his jaws onto the man's arm, dragging him down into the snow below. The scream was lost in the chaos, but David's heart nearly stopped as Shadow vanished from sight. "Shadow," he roared, fear tearing through him. But seconds later the shepherd reappeared, blood on his muzzle, eyes blazing as he limped back inside. He had driven the enemy back, but every return was costing him. David pulled him close, whispering fiercely, "Stay with me. Don't you dare leave me again." The gunfire raged on, but rescue was close. David clung to that thought as he fired again, striking a Shadow that dropped heavily in the snow. Miguel barked commands. Ethan whispered prayers, and Shadow never ceased his growling, his eyes fixed on every movement beyond the shattered windows. Then the distant thump of rotor blades broke through the storm, faint at first, but rising like salvation. David's heart surged. "They're here," he shouted, but the mercenaries must have heard too, for their assault grew desperate, their gunfire doubling their shouts a frenzy. Craven laughed, even bound on the floor, his voice thick with venom. "Do you really think they'll get to you before we finish this?" David snapped his head toward him, eyes blazing. "They'll get to us, and they'll take you with them. That's what terrifies you." He reloaded quickly, his hands steady despite the chaos, and rose just enough to fire 3 more rounds into the tree line, suppressing the attackers as the helicopter crested the ridge, its spotlight cutting through the snow. Miguel waved his arms through the broken window, signaling while David keyed the radio, his voice firm despite the roar. "We're pinned down! Hostiles on all sides! We need immediate extraction!" The pilot's voice crackled back, steady and urgent. "Hold position! We're bringing in tactical support." The helicopter swooped low, its floodlights scattering the mercenaries, but not all of them fled. One fired a rocket, the explosion shaking the tower so violently that beams cracked, dust and snow cascading from the rafters. David shielded Ethan with his body, Miguel covering them both as Shadow barked with such ferocity it seemed to shake the ground. The tower groaned, threatening collapse, but it held long enough for the tactical team to rappel down figures in bright orange windbreakers, storming into the fight. Within minutes, gunfire shifted from a chaotic barrage to precise bursts, mercenaries dropping one by one until silence fell again, broken only by the roar of the helicopter blades. David exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body sagging with exhaustion, his arms still wrapped protectively around Ethan. Miguel lowered his weapon, his shoulder-slumping eyes scanning the clearing to ensure it was truly over. Shadow limped heavily to David's side, resting his head against his chest, his body trembling, but his eyes never leaving the door. The tactical officer who entered first was Captain Sarah Lorne, her presence commanding her eyes sharp as she surveyed the wreckage. "Sergeant Brooks," she called. David nodded, his voice gravel. "3 officers, 1 K9, hostiles restrained. We have evidence." She strode forward, signaling her medics to retrieve Ethan and secure the prisoners. Craven sneered as federal agents lifted him to his feet, his wrists bound tight. "This won't hold," he spat. "You think cages can contain me?" Sarah's expression was steel. "You're finished." David rose unsteadily, leaning heavily on the desk, and looked down at Shadow. The shepherd met his gaze, wagging his tail once, despite the blood soaking his paw. David's throat tightened, but he managed to whisper, "We made it." Federal agents sat further down, their rifles resting on their knees, their prisoners bound and gagged, Marcus Craven's eyes burning with hatred even in defeat. Dawn spread across the Montana skylight, scattering through the clouds in pale streaks of amber and ice blue, a sight that made David's throat tighten, for it felt like the first sunrise he had truly seen in years. When they landed, the courthouse steps in, Helena became a place of reckoning. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, agents led Craven and his men into armored vans, and officers gathered in silent formation, their breath rising in clouds against the cold morning air. David stepped down from the chopper, Shadow limping beside him, the shepherd's head high despite his wounds, his eyes steady, though exhaustion weighed his body. Miguel followed, supporting Ethan with one arm, and together they approached the waiting crowd. The city council had convened quickly, too quickly for David's comfort. But he understood why the ledgers Miguel had secured were already unraveling a network of trafficking so vast it stretched across 3 states, implicating men in power, men with badges, men who had sworn oaths they had long since betrayed. Yet none of it mattered to David in that moment. Not the politics, not the case, not the reporters. What mattered was Shadow. 3 days later in the Ridgefield Animal Trauma Center, David sat quietly in a room scented with antiseptic and warm fur. Shadow resting on a padded cot with fresh bandages wrapped around his paw, his ribs checked, his wounds cleaned. A simple black leather collar lay on the table beside him, its tag gleaming with the words, Ranger K9, retired. David lifted it slowly, his hands trembling, and clipped it around the shepherd's neck. Shadow's ears flicked. His tail wagged once, then again, a rhythm soft but steady, and David felt tears prick his eyes. "You deserve this more than anyone," he whispered. Miguel and Ethan entered, then both bruised but smiling faintly, and Miguel handed David a folded piece of paper. "They wanted you to give this to him," Miguel said. David opened it, revealing a certificate from the city council, half official, half symbolic, declaring Shadow an honorary service K9. Attached was a small bronze badge in the shape of a paw print. David clipped it gently to the dog's new collar, his voice catching. "Still here," he murmured. The ceremony came a week later. Snow dusted the courthouse steps. Officers lined in full dress uniform, and townspeople gathered in quiet reverence. David stood with Miguel and Ethan at his side, Shadow beside him, wearing a new harness that bore only 2 words embroidered across its chest, "Still here." The crowd fell silent as David stepped forward, of his breath visible in the crisp air, his voice steady though heavy with emotion. "He's not just a survivor," he said, his hand resting on Shadow's back. "He's proof that loyalty doesn't die, that memory doesn't fade, and that when everything burns down, sometimes something stronger rises from the ash. This dog remembered me when the world forgot him, and in remembering, he saved not just my life, but all of ours. If you ever think no one remembers, you know this, someone does. No one is ever truly forgotten." His words carried into the silence until applause rose, quiet at first, then building, heartfelt and raw. Shadow barked once, sharp and certain, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls like a promise etched into the stone. Reporters wrote their stories, politicians debated, the federal cases grew larger with every passing day, but the image that remained with the people of Helena was not of Craven in chains, nor of ledgers filled with corruption. It was of a scarred German shepherd standing tall on the courthouse steps beside the men he had saved, his harness gleaming in the morning sun. In the weeks that followed, adoption papers were signed, making Shadow officially David's. At home, the shepherd found peace for the first time in years. Lying before the fireplace, his eyes half closed, no longer haunted by the cold forests he had once roamed alone. David would often wake in the night and find him watching silent and steady, as if guarding him still. And every time David would whisper, "Not this time, not ever again. You're home," Miguel healed. Ethan recovered, and the three of them visited often, their bond forged in fire and betrayal, now stronger than blood. They laughed, sometimes cried others, but always they remembered that survival had not been a gift. It had been earned by courage, sacrifice, and the unwavering loyalty of one who could not speak but who said more with a single bark than any words ever could. In time, David returned to work, though quieter, more thoughtful. And when rookies asked him why he carried dog treats in his cruiser, he only smiled and said, "Because you never know who will come back to save you." And Shadow, though retired, still rode in the passenger seat on some days, head out the window, ears catching the wind, his scars a testament not of weakness, but of battles fought and won. The end. If this story moved, you make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to know what you think, what part of this story struck you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's see how far this story can travel.